Okay, thanks very much for joining us. We'll just get started then. So, hello, my name is Ross Gibson. I'm a Practice Development Advisor at the Children and Young People's Centre for Justice, based within the University of Strathclyde Social Work and Social Policy Department. So thanks for coming along to today's webinar, which is going to be delivered by Professor Ali Fraser and Dr Fern Gillan from the University of Glasgow and from University of Strathclyde, respectively, who work together on the PHYVR project. And you'll see more details about PHYVR on the screen in front of us. Or you can also visit their website, which is changingviolence.org. And after today's webinar, we'll be sending out a number of links. Also, during today's webinar, Sally, who from our comms and events team, will be dropping some links into the Q&A tab, which you'll see on your screen. Chat is disabled for today's webinar, but please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions, or even to pose some points about what you're hearing from Ali or from Fern. So other thing to mention is that today's webinar has been recorded and will be hosted on the CYCJ website as soon as we've got it ready to go out. So thanks for coming along, and we're going to be hearing from Ali and Fern about the triple violence, safe spaces and violence prevention, which is a spin-off from the Public Health Youth Violence and Reduction project, which they'll tell you more about. So first of all, a wee bit of introduction. Dr Fern Gillan currently works at the University of Strathclyde, was previously at Glasgow, and before that she had the great honour of working alongside me at CYCJ. Long history of research in young people in general, children's healing system, EEI, and recently children's perceptions of youth violence. We also have Professor Ali Fraser from the University of Glasgow, who's got a long history in researching youth studies, gangs, territorialism, as well as international studies. And the two of them are going to talk us through their project. And they'll be very happy to answer any questions at the end of the webinar. So I now pass you over to Ali and Fern, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ross, for that very polite introduction. Surprisingly polite for you, I have to say. Okay, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have you all here. Good afternoon. Huge thanks, of course, to Ross and to CYCJ for the invitation. As Ross said, my name is Ali Fraser. This is Fern, and we're here to talk about a research project that we've been running for the last 4 years that we use the acronym PHYVR for: Public Health, Youth and Violence Reduction. And we're part of a larger team, so we're the kind of home team, Scotland, me, Fern and Susan McVie, based at Edinburgh, and the away team is Keir, Erwin Rogers, Luke Billingham and Tim Newburn, based south of the border. The project looks UK-wide, but today we're going to be mostly talking about Scotland. And as Ross said, there is some further information available at the links on this slide. So the starting point for the project was back in 2009. There was, as there is again once more today, a sense of crisis in the United Kingdom at the highest levels of politics regarding violence involving young people, particularly with bladed instruments. And at that time, this is now several prime ministers ago, Theresa May started using the language of public health responses to violence, or public health approaches to violence reduction. And that was quite a significant shift at the time, because a public health approach, as it's set out by the World Health Organization, is a kind of beyond criminal justice approach, one that tries to move away from policing and courts towards more holistic responses to children and young people, involving health, education, early years, and so on. So this was quite a big shift, that move upstream. And perhaps even more surprisingly, was the source of inspiration for this new language was Scotland. And on the slides here, we can see part of the reason why this inspiration occurred, which was the shift in Scotland's reputation, and particularly Glasgow's reputation, for violence during the period 2005 to 2015. So from a point after violence had been increasing at a kind of steady rate in the post-war period in Scotland, attributed by many to West Coast masculinities and alcohol and territorial violence, all these kinds of issues that have long been associated with Glasgow, in particular, the reputation of no mean city. We started to see a significant and sustained reduction in all forms of violence, but particularly serious violence involving young people over that 10-year period, and it was held out by many as a success story. So we saw the shift in the representation of Scotland from being the most violent country in the developed world in 2005 to just after that period of the Orange Line, international media reporting Glasgow now being a model for cutting crime. So this was the inspiration for Theresa May's new policies on public health approaches to violence reduction, and indeed our own study. So we became interested in, like, first of all, what had happened in Scotland, what were the causes and consequences of this reduction in violence, and whether in turn these lessons could translate south of the border. So we started off in 2020 conducting interviews with policymakers, politicians, police, social workers, teachers across Glasgow, Scotland, London, England, and Wales. So at different levels and at different scales. And what initially we were interested in was looking back the way at between the two orange lines in the previous slide of what were the kind of causes of violence reduction, and then secondly, how those messages were traveling south of the border. But in hindsight now, though, we realize that a lot of those interviews were done during lockdowns, the period where we were all kind of reduced into our individual and fragmented bubbles, and we were interviewing people from their homes or from their offices in some cases, looking back the way, and reading back through those interviews now, there is a sort of a sense of hopefulness about them that perhaps was a sign of the times, that people were wanting to look back the way at perhaps a more hopeful time. But as we moved out of those bubbles and lockdown started to ease, and we as researchers started to meet people face to face, we started to find some differences unexpectedly. So, like, when we were doing the first interviews, the sort of slightly more hopeful ones, we were developing this idea of what we called the growing chorus. The idea that the causes of violence reduction in Scotland were about people across multiple different sectors, between politics, policy, community, social work, education, everyone gradually over time starting to use similar language, starting to speak in the language of prevention or trauma-informed, and over time a whole set of practice-based changes occurring kind of in tandem that added up to this overall change. And but as lockdowns eased, as I said, and people began meeting face to face, we felt something had changed. We started hearing less about the successes of the past and much more about the problems of the present, as fragmented young people were suddenly thrust together once more. And this was brought home tragically in the death of a young boy in Glasgow in October 2021. I think it's fair to say that this marked a major turning point in the research. As much as we continued to look backwards between the goalposts of the orange lines there, we also increasingly turned our attention to what was right of the line, what was happening right now. And we learned quickly that those on the front lines of the COVID aftermath, working with young people, were deeply concerned with what had happened when young people had been left to their own devices. So after that, we started increasingly doing interviews with community workers, youth workers, and young people themselves. And most importantly of all, probably, and you'll hear much more about this in a moment, was a collaborative action research project that Fern led on with a group of young men affected by violence that call themselves, rightly, the wise men, and they're pictured in the slide there. And we listened to them and learned with them, and worked with, like, young people elsewhere in Glasgow and in London to try to understand from a kind of street level what was happening today, and indeed whether lessons from the past could still apply to the present. From the get-go, though, we realised that these issues were urgent issues, and these were not things that could benefit from the luxury of academic chin-stroking and going away into an office for years to try to make sense of them. So we were, from the get-go, trying to engage with frontline workers, policymakers, and practitioners to try to share some of the information that we were gathering, either by hosting events or, as is on the slides here, publishing briefing papers that tried to summarize these ideas as they were happening, and open conversations with people that might be able to turn them into practice-based changes. And one of them that we're working on currently is a school resource for violence prevention developed in collaboration with the Wise Men that Fern will talk about in just a moment. At the same time, though, we have been trying to take a bit of a step back and assess all the information that we've gathered, because there's a lot. We've spoken to nearly 200 people. We've amassed all kinds of statistics from Glasgow, London, and nationally. We've a whole raft of policy documents that we've been sifting our way through. And so what we're going to share with you today are some of those urgent findings that I just referred to, but also some of our efforts to make sense of that, to sift through it and to come up with ideas and themes that try to pin it together. And these are themes that we're going to be publishing later on this year in 2 books. The first, Preventing Violence, lead authored by our colleague Keir, which focuses really on the evolution of the violence reduction units in England and Wales. We carried out interviews with the directors of every violence reduction unit in England and Wales, of which there's now more than 20. And then the book on the left there, which has the title, The Public Health Approach to Violence Reduction, Stories, Movements and Hope. That's an effort to distill our ideas from across the piece, both Scotland and England, to understand what happened and what changed and what are the forms of potential in that. Now, just by way of kind of introduction and kind of transfer over to Fern, I just wanted to share one graphic with you, developed by our good friend and colleague Luke Billingham, which he calls the 4 eyes of violence reduction, which I always try not to take as an insult as someone who is a spectacle wearer. The 4 eyes of violence reduction is, I guess, our effort at trying to turn some of this information and data into something that makes sense at a different level. And that is to understand violence and violence reduction as happening at multiple different scales. I mean, this is the idea from the World Health Organization of the public health approach, which has something called the ecological model, whereby you understand violence not just at an individual community level, but also at a national level and a macro level of social inequalities. So this is our attempt to summarize that into 4 eyes. So they range from the inequalities in society, institutions, interventions, and interactions. When we were looking between the goalposts at what had changed in Scotland, one of the things we came up with was this idea of the growing chorus, as I said, people stepping forward and lending their voice from different positions. And we think, like, through the doing of that, we did see change at some of these levels. We saw some changes in relationships and interactions, in interventions and programs, and to some extent in institutions. But what we didn't see, crucially, is changes in the inequalities that exist in society. So when we started looking at violence as it was affecting children, young people today, those wicked problems that flow from inequality were still there, but they had changed in the post-COVID context. So I'm now going to hand over to Fern to hear some of what we learned from our community-based research in Glasgow, using this idea of triple violence, that is violence upon, between, and among young people. Only by understanding the connections between these different forms of violence and building safe spaces for young people and communities to meaningfully enter into debate, I think, can we start to address all 4 eyes rather than just 2 or 3. So thanks very much, and over to you, Fern.
Thanks, Ali, and hi everyone. It's really nice to be here today and chatting to you all.
Your
like
camera's
Ali
off,
says,
by the way, Fern.
Oh, so cheers, Ali. Thanks. Yeah, it's really nice to be here and talk to you today. I've got the cheery job of talking about the problems of the present, and I was just reflecting that it's quite it can be quite grim, but we hope, like Ali was saying, that it resonates with your kind of experiences as well. I also want to thank the participants that took part in this part of the survey. So the grassroots organisations who gave their time, the youth workers, the community activists, and particularly the young people, and especially the 4 wise men who Ali says we've been working with over a number of years and have taught us just so much. So I'm going to talk mostly in the context of the Scottish data that we got from the street, because that's the data I know best. But I think it's important to note that, broadly speaking, we saw the same issues in London on the street as we did in Glasgow. So broadly, they all fall under the triple violence framework that we're going to talk about. But obviously, they had their own kind of local flavours, their kind of local dynamics. So, keep losing my mouth. So we heard from practitioners about a range of struggles or harms that impact the lives of young people and the work that is going on in communities. So as Ali said, when we think about safety and security for young people, we need to think about all the types of violence that they face. So we've developed this idea of triple violence, and we think it might be a helpful framework when designing interventions or thinking about support to ensure that we're taking account of all these levels as they kind of intertwine and impact on individuals. So as Ali said, we've got violence upon, which is caused by the kind of unfair and unequal systems. Then we've got violence among, so that's kind of interpersonal violence between young people, and then violence within, which is that kind of self-directed violence. And I'll talk about each in turn. Now, obviously, these aren't new ideas, but we think that exploring them together and looking at that interaction between those levels is really quite a helpful framework to be using. And I'm keen to hear your kind of thoughts on that as we go forward. So the first one then is violence upon. So here people spoke about various forms of harm from kind of unfair and unequal social systems. So in particular, a lot of people were talking about poverty and inequality really bearing down on communities. And another kind of big issue that was raised was also the impact of kind of racialized and classed social and state systems as well. So people were talking about going without, not having enough, or as one young person from London described it, as being financially dead. But for workers, for one worker, it kind of went beyond just financial poverty. It was more than poverty of like money. It was poverty of opportunity, poverty of aspiration, poverty of sort of life goals. And people were telling us that they felt that their communities were being neglected. So they were describing them as being dumping grounds or a long time forgotten. Young people were telling us that there's terrible transport links, that there's no job opportunities, that the housing's crap, and that they don't have a lot of green space to go out and play or kind of hang around. And the sense was definitely that this was getting worse. So government austerity was impacting not just individuals, but also the supportive services that are there to kind of be a safety net for people. So one person spoke about there being less teachers, more competition for funding, and less service. And that what did exist was running at capacity, and there was this feeling that there just wasn't enough support for young people. A lot of people kind of expressed this urgent need to fund communities and youth projects, and that there was just like a huge gap in that was something that had really been stripped away. There's also this sense that those structural conditions made it really hard to think about the future. So again, the quote on the screen says a lot of the times it's just daily, there's no long term, and they're talking about young people kind of going living day to day and just trying their best to get by. But I think that's just as true for the services who were trying to provide support as it was for the young people. Unsure about budgets and things really limited what services could offer young people because they just didn't know how long they would be around for. And this obviously could lead to feelings of kind of social exclusion, a lack of community cohesion, And people, young people in particular in the area of Glasgow that we were working in, and certainly in London, spoke a lot about gentrification as well, that their communities were becoming less and less for them. And some great quotes from young people, as their community was changing to suit a more kind of affluent demographic. A young person said, I mean, where I stay, it's just one big coffee shop. And knowing the area, there's a lot of coffee shops and they don't drink coffee. And another young person compared where they stayed, their kind of scheme within a community as being like a kind of, a Vatican in Rome, that there was an exclusion zone that wasn't for them, that where money was going, and that they were left on the kind of outskirts of that. So these are obviously like huge, big societal issues, but they weren't in the background. They were impacting young people, their families, and the services that they relied on. And as these difficulties kind of deepen and the supportive services that are around are stretched, you can see how young people become pulled into illegal activities and potentially violence. And I mean, that's just a snippet of what was covered in Violence Upon It. I can only really give you snippets of each. Like I've not spoke about policing or racialized oppression, but I think that maybe gives you a bit of a flavour around the violence upon. So if we think of violence upon as kind of being those structural things bearing down on young people and communities, then violence within is at the kind of opposite end of the scale. So here we're talking about self-directed violence, which manifested itself through self-harm, risk-taking behaviour, drug use, mental health crises, and just a more kind of general sense of hopelessness. We're hugely aware of young people's mental health, particularly following COVID. But practitioners were really articulate in explaining how these mental health difficulties could be kind of transferred into violence. So violence being symptomatic of the trauma, distress, and inadequate support that young people were facing. So these inner tensions could spill over and become violent emotions, particularly if young people are kind of provoked. We also heard about the kind of weight of trauma, of distress, of fear of violence, being linked to the use and mind-altering substances. So young people using drugs and alcohol just to escape the reality of what they were feeling. And the reality of the situation that I've described before about the violence upon, it was really creating immense hardship for young people to cope with. So they were worried about these issues, how they were going to afford things, how their parents were going to afford things, how they were going to get a job, how they were going to escape this kind of rut that they found themselves in. So while we don't think that self-directed violence and the link to other types of violence is new, I think we're getting a lot better at identifying it. But practitioners still spoke about struggling with that shift. So I remember speaking to one really experienced social worker and them saying, back in the day when we were safety planning or risk assessing, it was very much around gang violence on a Friday, Saturday night when, the young people had been drinking or after school, and it was kind of hot spots and times. Whereas with this violence within, they were concerned about young people all the time, every day, all the time, and that sat differently with them, and that required a very different response. So there was a sense that in Glasgow, the reduction that Ali had been talking about, that maybe violence within had replaced those kind of traditional forms of violence. But I think the link between violence within young people and violence between young people is pretty evident to us. And then finally, there's obviously violence that occurs between young people. And I think a lot of the time this is where our focus lies. It's definitely where a lot of media and political attention is, and perhaps less at points in the other types of violence that we've spoke about. So Ali spoke about the decline in Glasgow, and certainly our community participants did the same. So there was a lot of chat around, it's nothing like it used to be in those, really bad days. Staff were and practitioners were talking about, coming in on a Monday and it not being unusual to hear that there had been a stabbing or a loss of life over the weekend. So there's just this sense that for the majority of young people, the streets are safer, and young people themselves said that that was the case. For the majority of young people, they're free to kind of scheme hop, that the city is quite accessible to them, and local areas are quite accessible to them. But I think just because it's not as bad as it once was, that doesn't mean that the issues have been solved. So violence between young people remains a real issue for some. And considering what I've just presented and kind of compounded by the impact of the pandemic and lockdown, it's no surprise that the people we were speaking to in communities were really concerned about these tensions starting to bubble away again. And we have, unfortunately, as Ali says, seen that transpire in some really tragic incidents. So two issues that I wanted to raise in relation to kind of current violence between young people that we were hearing about from young people and practitioners. The first one's kind of social media. So we know that social media has changed all of our lives, and young people in particular. And it was certainly attributed to creating a new dynamic around violence between young people. So that could be kind of threats and hostilities being made on social media, and then the potential for that to spill out into real life. But there's also a sense that it amplifies the fear of violence. So this sense that there's threat and risk everywhere because it's all we see online. And I think as well for the young people we were working with, like the thought of saying, well, why don't you just delete your social media? Why don't you just come off? It was just literally unthinkable. And it also played into kind of stereotypes around backing down and or being scared. So there was just this thing of it was an inevitability and it had to happen, but it was having such an impact. I think I also want to say as well though, we heard and like social media is quite a kind of contested space, but we heard loads of good things about social media as well, and a lot of young people saying that they found community and support through social media and their phones and their internet and gaming and different types of things. And for a lot of practitioners, they were kind of critical of that focus on social media and kind of arguing that social media changes the dynamic, but it doesn't change the underlying causes of what is causing youth violence. And I think that we need to be really mindful of that it's maybe a different framing, but that we can't just rely on that kind of simple narrative that is much more complex than that. And obviously it's inevitable. We're not going to go backwards. So it's how we use that going forward. And then the second dynamic that I think is worth mentioning around violence between individuals is the link with drug markets. So that was the effect of drug use, drug sale, and drug debt. And you can see again how that links back to the violence upon. So money from drug sales offers opportunities to improve young people's lives through solidarity or financial gain. And in the face of poverty and a kind of lack of opportunity, you can see how that can draw young people in. But obviously it has significant impacts on community well-being and quite often led to violence and self-violence as well. So kind of going through triple violence, I hope we've made clear that the violence that occurs between young people, it's inseparable from the suffering and harm that's caused by unfair systems that are really pressing down on young people and communities. And that inequality and isolation and exclusion really reverberates within their lives. And that young people are almost caught in the middle of this, and that's where we start to see some of these, again, really complex dynamics of violence between young people. Told you I was going to be really cheery. I hope you are all doing okay. So against this backdrop of triple violence, one of the most kind of significant things we heard from young people was how they negotiate safety and insecurity in their everyday lives. And all the young people we spoke to would speak about this idea of having safe spaces. I don't know why. Oh, yeah, safe spaces. So I'm just going to talk a wee bit about some of the safe spaces that young people identified and kind of told us about. So the first safe space was their communities and the street. So it's that kind of third space between school, school and home. It's not school, it's not home. It's that kind of third space. So the streets were seen to be safe for the majority of young people, but even for those that wasn't the case, they could still identify safety and security within their own patch, within their own scheme, and particularly with their own group of friends. And that was their community. I was at a presentation yesterday by an amazing PhD student who's over visiting from Norway, I think. Sorry if I've got that wrong. Who was talking about care and compassion in that kind of street space. And I think that's really important for us to acknowledge as well. One of the young people we work with, when Ross actually asked them what he enjoyed about working with us on the Wise Men project, he said, it's all of us coming together because we're one big family now. And that getting together was the thing that he enjoyed most. And I think we need to consider how we foster those caring and compassionate relationships between young people in safe ways and provide opportunities for them to flourish, particularly in light of that retracting state and community support. I think for young people, they can feel that sometimes they only have each other. So how do we harness that in a way that is kind of helpful? The second safe space that young people spoke about with real affection and just real joy was about their kind of local community-based initiatives, and whether they were involved with them now or whether they'd fallen away. They really like reflected on that time spent as really, really positive. So it could be G20 or G15 or RAPA or FAIR or PEAT. It didn't really matter, and that's only just to name a few. And it's so hard to describe the kind of benefits that young people got from these spaces, but it's just really special. So they describe them as spaces where they can go and form kind of lasting and trusting relationships with adults who can support them. They also spoke about it being a place where they can learn new skills, gain opportunities, but most importantly, just have fun and be safe. And it was a place they could return to, which I think in this first quote really is striking. I think they said, a young person said, I think it was just because when I was younger, I knew this was a place that I enjoyed and that I felt safe in, and I could go back and forth. And I've always ended up back there because I know it's a safe place for me. And to have that as a kind of lifeline was just really important to young people. They spoke so highly of youth workers, people who worked in community centres, people who became supportive adults, mentors, real champions for them, and also friends. And they wanted more spaces like this in their communities. They wanted them in their local area so that they're easy to access, and they wanted them staffed by local people who know the area and who know the issues that they're facing, and the kind of reality. So, like I say, when those spaces are available, they were able to speak about the kind of transformational impact that it has on their lives. And the third safe space I want to highlight is school. Now, I'm not saying by any matter of means that young people told us that they love school and that they love going there. In fact, most of them didn't. A lot of the young people we spoke to as well were in fact excluded from mainstream education, either formally, but many of them informally. And many were on kind of reduced timetables or attended nurture rooms or were part of kind of alternative curriculum services. But what they were talking about when they were talking about school was often kind of support hubs or bases within school. And these were quite often staffed by support staff or youth workers. And it was because of the efforts of these kind of individuals that they continued to see school as a safe space, even if they didn't enjoy school or attend school for education purposes. So they spoke about it being a place of safety, that they could attend appointments, that they could access support, they could take part in things that they did like, whether that was kind of extracurricular activities or arts-based things, or even research projects. And for the group of the wise men, it also did provide kind of physical safety as well. They were able to go to the school when they felt physically unsafe and knew that there are people who would know how to respond to that unsafety. And school was often a place where they wanted to have a connection to, even if they weren't attending for education. And I want to play a short clip which comes from the violence reduction resource that the wise men have created. So they did an extended interview with the ex-gang member and award-winning author Graham Armstrong, and they watched his series on gangs, and then they gave him a good grilling and asked them loads of random and amazing questions. And then at the end of the interview, he flips it on them and asks them some questions. And this, I think, is a really powerful quote of a young person talking about their experience of school and losing that connection with school. So fingers crossed this works. So I think that's just really powerful, talking about that feeling of being shipped off and being lucky enough to get allowed back in to school when young people have a right to education. And I think not without its challenges, but I think it's just a really, really striking example. So overall, young people spoke to us about places closing down. They spoke to us about being thrown out of school. They spoke to us about workers changing roles and moving on, the isolation of lockdown, and their places of safety changing, often shrinking or disappearing altogether. And practitioners too, they noted how hard it was for them to do more with less, and just this overwhelming feeling of fighting against the tide. And I remember sometimes it feeling really uncomfortable, even for me as a researcher, to kind of feel that anxiety that practitioners had. And I think I'll just end with a quote from a practitioner who kind of said, you know, the concern is that if there's nothing in their communities and if there's nothing happening, then they're going to build a community elsewhere. And I think then we have to ask, to what end? And on that cheery note, Ali, I'll hand back over to you to end on a high.
Thanks, Fern. But really, thanks, Fern. That was fantastic. And what I wanted to finish on really is, I mean, two things. One, I was just reflecting as you were talking there, Fern. Obviously, like these are extremely difficult things to hear. But this is the reality of what we were told, and we're in the process of trying to make sense of it and figure out what we can do with it. And that's why occasions like this are so important, actually, to open things up and hear whether that resonates and what might be done. But I do wonder, like where we started, I guess, in the project, back speaking to people online as we are now, and people talking with a bit more hope about the past, about that growing chorus of change when things were also desperate and there was also a crisis then. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that kind of pale flame of hope that we can reconnect with in trying to deal with the current crisis. On that note, I suppose, like the last thing I just wanted to flag is the work that is still ongoing from this project. And Fern alluded to the violence prevention resource that, along with the Wise Men, she's been working on for the last 18 months or so. And they have now co-created a whole raft of amazing things. And you saw a little clip from the Graham Armstrong video there. They also made and shot a film about their everyday lives, about Friday nights, fighting and friendship. They made a board game called Roll With It about the snakes and ladders of street life. They made a rap called My Pain, My Life, which tells, like, straight from the heart their experiences of life in the scheme. And we're also in the process of making a podcast series called Young Warriors that tries to tell positive and hopeful lessons from street culture. So that's my effort, Ferna, ending with a little like sprinkle of hope after all the darkness that you've walked through. But thank you, Ross. Thank you, Ferna. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And we're totally happy to take comments or questions.
Ali, Fern, that was amazing. Thank you very much for a really interesting input. And please pass on our thanks from CYCJ to the Wise Men and everybody else who contributed to the project, because I know that I know that you certainly agree, but the work that you produced and presented today wouldn't have been possible without them. And ending on that note of how those young men have produced those resources is a really great way to end the webinar. I'm going to just offer some short reflections on the things that sprung into my mind as I was listening to the two of you. But for everybody else that's on the call, can I please encourage you to use the Q&A function and drop your questions or comments or suggestions even in there for Fern and Ali, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. But as we were going through the presentation, Ali and Fern, it struck me what I really liked about it was the way that you made the links to the ecological nature of the lives of the children and young people that practitioners and teachers and family members support, and the way that something that has happened so away out there on the governmental level, even an international level, can have a significant impact on the children and young people that we're talking about. And although you never went into detail, the austerity, the neoliberal approaches that we've been imposed upon us for the last 40 odd years is certainly evident in the way in which these young people are talking about their communities being hollowed out and lack of spaces for them to go. And what I really enjoyed about the presentation is the way in which you've suggested some elements which will give us some hope, and the young people in question have pointed to the things that we as adults and people with a degree of power and people with responsibility should be bearing in mind as we consider what services we put in place to prevent people from being in this situation, reduce harm being caused to, by and from the children. and try and reduce the number of children who face, make, or take the highest level of risk. And on that note, I'll maybe move on to the first question, which it was from Claire from South Lanarkshire. And you've touched on it in the last few slides, but her question was, and maybe you could expand on it. Her question is about what did you learn from the project regarding what young people are telling us about how to create safe spaces, what can we do to make their lives a bit better?
Darren, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Claire. I have been reflecting a lot on that, and I've worked really closely with the wise men for a long time, and I was thinking about what they taught me, and I think it's about hearing and listening to them and hearing what they are saying and giving them a seat at the table. And I think sometimes there's the concern that as kind of risk escalates, young people are kind of encouraged not to take part in these nice projects or nice thing, or, you know, fun, because we're so concerned about the level of risk that becomes our priority, and then we stop hearing what they're actually asking for. And a lot of the time, I think it's to be heard and have a space where they can be heard. I'm thinking back, Ross interviewed one of the wise men to ask him about his experience of co-production, and he was talking about things like having time. So the most important thing we could do as workers is give young people time to take part, time to decide what they want to do, time to decide how they want to do it. And quite often that's the thing we don't have. Like, I'm meeting you now and I need to know what you want and I need to hear your voice straight away. So I think time is one thing. He spoke about the opportunity to take part. So again, they were going through a lot when we started working with them. And actually, he speaks about how that helped him in his journey more broadly. So I think, again, like, not excluding young people or thinking that they can't take part because of that. And love, like, so he also says, if you show love, they'll show love. And I think, again, that's something when we're busy and we are concerned about a lot of things, that sometimes that can kind of fall away. But yeah, so it's relationships, it's time, and it's handing over power as well, and that choice, and letting them lead some of what they want. I think.
Maybe just a quick follow-up to that, Ross, if that's okay. Sure. I think like the question of time is a really important but also poignant one. Because I remember, Farron, like you telling me once that, like, over the course of the time that you were working with the wise men, there were 7 different individuals or organizations that came and went with working with them. And so like that question of time is like really important and weighted though. But we also think about that as it's sort of the flip side or the underside of austerity that Ross mentioned. Like, a lot of the organizations with the best will in the world are really stretched, and perhaps each one of those workers wanted to stay longer than they were able to, but had to step back. So you see the impact of those big changes, like in a macro level changes that you mentioned, Ross, from the micro level of the interactions and the relationships. So like, I guess it's finding ways to repair those broken relationships.
Thanks, Ali and Fern. And I think that the points you've made there kind of respond to a quote. A point has been made by Alan, who I'll read it out or summarise it. He has talked about the added precarity of care experience young people who make their ability to maintain connections and roots, and even living in the one location at times, is at a disadvantage because of the care experience and the fractured nature at times of their accommodation. And he posed the question, how do you think resources and networks around the young people in their current form can do this when there is such frequent and often unplanned change, particularly when young people are learning that these connections may not ever be stable? And I don't know if that resonates with the work or the life experiences of any of the young men or the people in the PHYVR project more broadly. And what's your thoughts on the points raised there by Alan?
I mean, I guess if I don't know if we have any answers, which is the typical kind of academic academic kind of response, but I think it's recognizing that flux in young people's lives. Like Ali says, I think it was even within the first kind of 6 months of working with the Wise Men that those 7 people had come and gone. I was speaking to one of them last week, and he was telling me about 3 new workers that he had. A new social worker, a new drugs worker, and something else. And I asked their names, and he couldn't tell me the names of any of them. And I kind of understand why, because why would he invest in relationships that for him might not last? Again, that care experience was also a factor in that. That will be 3 new workers in the 30 in the past year kind of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure how you get that consistency or how you target resource towards that. But it is certainly an issue that I think together we need to keep highlighting and work together to find solutions for that.
Thanks, Fran. A comment that's came in, it's more a question, but I suppose I'll reframe it as a question. Somebody's praising the work that you've done and thanking you for everything you've delivered today, and they're saying that it sounds like human rights in action. And I wondered, Fern, this is maybe more you kind of do your street. Have you thought about the work that you've been doing through the Wise Men or PHYVR more broadly through the eyes of UNCRC? And what's your thoughts on the wider project in terms of Article 12 and participation and the right to a voice? And feel free to tie it into the CPD thing that I'm working on just now if you want.
Yeah, so I think it is fundamental to Article 12. Like I say, I think, and like this is stuff we know that we hear less from the young people who are at that kind of end of the scale. And like I just reflect on when I met them and what I was told about them. And it was all about risk and what they were involved in and what their system contact was. And none of it was about the fact that they're massive Celtic fans and that they love Still Game and that they can quote Still Game like that. It wasn't about the dodgy music choices and all that, you know. So I think there's something about rights kind of come after taking a human approach, like first and foremost. And I think I don't think I've actually thought about the work in terms of the rights agenda, but I have used it in various meetings and things around particularly the right to education. So for the Wise Men and a lot of the other young people who have participated, they're not in education, and a lot of the time that is that or mainstream kind of full-time education, a lot of the time that is down to the level of risk and whatever else they're involved in. But that doesn't mean they don't have a right to education. So I think sometimes it's quite easy to kind of exclude them and then not follow that up. But the project also started because with the Wise Men, because the boys were so aware of how they were being discussed and that there was a lot of interest in them, but that they felt no one really understood their lives. So I think that's all we were kind of aiming to do, was to give them an opportunity to tell their story. And it's obviously evolved and become a lot more than that, but that's all they were actually asking for. Was the opportunity to tell their side of the story and and share a bit about their lives and their interests and their hopes. And I think that's fundamental to kind of developing better interventions and supports, and also just, and that is a rights-based approach as well.
Yeah.
I think it kind of connects, Fern, with the, not to get all academic for a minute, but like the conversations we've had about epistemic injustice and justice. The idea of epistemic injustice being like you view young people through a glass darkly. You view them as gang members or as risky or as criminals. So you're already got your blinkers on before you start, which means you can't see them and you can't hear them. And the contrast to that being, like, I think a great example of it being your work with the Wise Men of epistemic justice, of like trying to properly build a safe, rights-based space for them to talk about their lives and tell you what they want and need. And I think that perhaps is where the rights comes into, is like trying to challenge those kind of limiting, narrow perceptions of young people and replace them with just like corridors that you can communicate through.
Which I think is a really nice place to finish. So just wrapping up, I'm really sorry we never get through all the questions in the comments that were raised. And I think the fact that we're going on to 2 minutes to 12, 2 minutes to 1 rather, we still have so many people in line is testament of how much people have enjoyed the content today, Ali and Fern. So thank you. Finally, just 3 things I want to say before we finish up. First of all, CYCJ, we've got a number of participation projects that we're involved in. So if you think that the young people that you're working with would like to take part in something similar to what Fern had been describing with the Wise Men, whether they've experienced a secure care or the justice system more broadly, please get in touch with any of us at CYCJ and we can point you in the right directions. Second of all, is to flag up the availability of some of those resources that Fern and Ali were talking about. They'll be published on the SCCJR website very shortly, and we'll send you the link and we'll advertise it in our e-bulletin when that is available. And there's more information about that within the chat. And the final thing is to flag up our future webinars. So we've got a number of webinars here at CYCJ. In a couple of weeks' time, we're looking at the social harms experienced by children both within Scotland and care experienced children within Scotland and Wales. A fortnight after that, or thereabouts, we're looking at a history of sibling sexual abuse in Scotland and the research carried out upon that. And in the following month, we're looking at youth adult probation hubs from England and what we can learn from those. And there's more to come after that. So the link for all the future webinars is in the chat. So finally, this couldn't have happened without Sally, who's coordinated everything behind the scenes. So thank you, Sally, for helping us out. Thanks for everyone for coming, and hope to see you at a future webinar, if not before then.